continuing our examination of the resurrection, especially as put forth by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. The lesson's not going to be quite as long as normal. I've kind of had a new flare-up with my arm. Surprised when you heard it wasn't going to be as long as normal. There wasn't clapping and applause and dancing in the aisles. We've been looking now, again, from 1 Corinthians 15. We've looked all the way up through verse 28. So we're going to begin this section, verses 29 through 34, where the resurrection is demanded. That's what I called it. The resurrection demanded. He says in verse 29, to get us started, otherwise. That is really the key word in understanding these next 5 verses. The word otherwise. It is a very important word because it's one of those connecting words. It connects with what he's just been saying, what he's just been talking about. I wonder if it needs to go high.
It just comes and goes.
I know. It comes and goes, like me. So it is. It's about what he's just been talking about, and that's the only way to understand these verses. He says, otherwise, what will they do who are baptized for the dead if the dead do not rise at all? Why then are they baptized for the dead? Paul's a great logical speaker and writer. He wants you to think with your mind. He wants you to reason. He wants you to use logic. He's saying if all that's stated in the preceding is not fact, if it's not fact, then why are these people doing what they're doing? Paul says if we are baptized based upon the belief that the dead are raised, and the dead are not actually raised, why be baptized at all? See, that's his point. Some people have taken this, of course, completely out of context, and various religious groups are baptizing people who are physically dead. Well, that's not the context at all of what he's talking about. He wants you to understand that if we are baptized based on our belief that there's a resurrection, and there's not a resurrection, what's the point? Well, Paul says there isn't any point. But one thing this definitely does teach is the necessity of baptism. Because notice how Paul connects baptism with the teaching of the resurrection. They go hand in hand. No resurrection, baptism doesn't have any value. Okay? If baptism has a value, its value rests upon the fact that the dead will be raised one day. So, there's his main point in verse 29. In the next 3 verses, he carries that point further. It's so dangerous to take one verse, like religious groups have done, verse 29, and take it completely out of context. That's the most dangerous thing to do in the Bible. You always look at the verses preceding it. You look at the verses coming after it. So he goes on and asks them, and why do we stand in jeopardy every hour? He says, I affirm by the boasting in you which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. If in the manner of men I have fought with beasts at Ephesus, what advantage is it to me? If the dead do not rise, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Notice again how he's using reason. He wants these Corinthians to use their mind. Think. He says, think. Why should men place their lives in jeopardy every hour if there's no life after death? He says, why would you do that? Why would you risk your life? If this life is all there is. If that's all you've got, why risk it? It doesn't make sense, Paul says. If the dead are not raised, why not do what? Let's eat and drink and party and have a good time. Since we die, that's when we die, we cease to exist. I mean, if this life is all there is to it, Paul says, live it up. I think several years ago there was a commercial, and that was what the commercial was. You know, live it up now. This is it. So do everything you want. Eat, drink, be merry, have a party, have a good time. But Paul says, since there is a resurrection, Paul says, what have I been doing? I die daily. In other words, I risk my life every day, Paul says. Why? Because there's a resurrection. Paul says, I wouldn't do it if there wasn't a resurrection. And Paul had preached in lots of dangerous situations. For instance, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Beginning in verse 25, Paul says, verse 24. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil and sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst and fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Why would anybody in their right mind undergo that for no reason? If there was not a resurrection, Paul says, why would anybody do that? The answer was they wouldn't. Paul says, I do it because I know there's a resurrection. I'm 100% convinced there's a resurrection. And that, of course, our resurrection, as he had already argued, is based upon the fact that Jesus was resurrected. He was the first fruits from the dead. That's what Paul says. Well, he goes on and says in verse 33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. He says, don't be misled. Here's a warning against people who are trying to teach something that is against the Bible. That's what this verse is all about. Paul says, don't be deceived, don't be misled. People are going to tell you there's no resurrection. Paul says, don't believe them. Don't make companions of people who teach something false. It says, don't make companions of them. Any teaching contrary to the doctrine of God, he says, don't make companions of them. Yes, take time to try and teach them the truth, but don't make companions of them. Previously in this letter, back in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul had warned about something similar, beginning in verse 14. That's what I was thinking of, right, verse. I can't believe I wrote that down. There is a verse and verses in the Bible that tell us, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And that's kind of what he's saying here in 1 Corinthians 15:33. It says, don't be misled. You be careful about who you hang out with. Don't let them mislead you. Don't let them deceive you. Don't do it. It's the most dangerous thing in the world. And I'm sure everybody knows people who have had companions, close friends that they spend lots of time with that over time misled them, led them away from the truth. He says, don't let that happen. It's very, very dangerous. Well, he ends this little session by saying, awake to righteousness and do not sin. For some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. See, he says, false beliefs, they're like intoxicating. And I think that's why so many people today are misled. Because they're intoxicated with what people tell them. Yeah, if you believe this, if you come and be a part of our church, our faith, all of these things will happen, and they're intoxicated by it. So Paul says, be awake. Wake up to righteousness and don't sin. He says, some do not have the knowledge of God. And I would today make that statement for most do not have the knowledge of God. And he says, I speak this to your shame. So, don't be misled. If you're misled, Paul says, it's your own fault. Because you know the truth. When he goes on in the next section, he talks about, he answers the question, some people can't understand how this physical body that's placed in the ground is going to be made alive and come out of the ground. So Paul answers that question in the next few verses. He says, but someone will say, verse 35, how are the dead raised up, and with what body do they come? So some of the Corinthians didn't understand how these material, physical bodies, which were subject to sickness and death, decay, how could that live forever? See, they couldn't see how a body planted in the ground could be raised up. So that's what Paul's going to answer them. And he answers them by telling them, look out in the world. Just look out at the natural world. Verse 36, foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. Now, of course, this was a farming area. They knew about farming and planting, sowing, reaping. They knew all about that. So that's what Paul's going to use to explain what's going to happen. So Paul here refers to seeds that's sown in the ground. Well, you plant a little corn seed, it's like that big. You plant it in the ground, and what comes up? Another little corn seed like that? No. A whole plant that grows several feet in the air. That's what Paul's trying to get them to understand. What you sow is not made alive unless it dies. Actually, Jesus said something similar to this back in John chapter 12. Hopefully this is the right verse. In verse 24, Jesus says, most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. Well, that's what Paul is saying here. That's exactly what he's saying. What appears to be dead is waiting for something better. That little seed is waiting for something better. Yeah, you put it in the ground. It doesn't look like much. Looks like it's dead. It's not. It's got life in it. So Paul says, and what you sow, you do not sow that body that shall be, but mere grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain. They knew all about, planting wheat and other types of grain, barley. They knew about those things. Most people were involved in sowing, planting. They knew all about that. So what happens? A man plants a bare kernel, a seed, in hopes of what? Not just digging up the seed, but a big, full, blooming, flowering plant. That's the hope. That's what he wants to happen. Seen it happen before, wants it to happen again. And we know that a seed reproduces after its kind. And that is also a point Paul is emphasizing here. The plant reproduces after its kind. That's how God made it. Go back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. That's how he made it. Plants reproduce after their kind. Corn seeds are not going to produce a tomato plant. Doesn't happen. Reproduces after its kind. So Paul says in verse 38, but God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body. That seed appears to die. It appears to rot, but what happens? Well, in the spring, comes to life. There you see it. It's starting to come up through the ground. You see some green coming up out of the ground. It looked like when you planted it and covered it with dirt, I don't see anything there. Well, no. God gives it a body as He pleases. See, it's God that does it. You know, God is behind, every seed you plant. God is behind it. He's the one that gives it the body just like He wants it to have. When you plant that corn seed, God is the one that designed the corn to have the kind of plant that grows up. See, God is able to do that, and this is what Paul is emphasizing. God is able to give that plant the kind of body that it needs. So he goes on in verse 39, all flesh is not the same flesh, but there's one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, and another of birds. See, why is Paul saying that? Because he's still answering the question, what kind of body will the dead have? So he says, look around you. There's all different types of flesh. He says, men have one type of flesh, and animals have another type of flesh, and fish has a type of flesh, and birds have a type of flesh. God made all of those, gave all of them flesh, just the way they needed to have flesh. God is able to do that. God has, and from the beginning, has given all of those animals and so forth the appropriate kind of flesh for what they are, for what they do. The flesh of birds wouldn't work on the flesh of fish, and vice versa. But God knew that and designed them accordingly. God can change, if He can do that with animals and fish and birds, He can do that with man. In other words, He can change man's body in the resurrection, but still be recognized as a man. And then in the last two verses of our lesson, there's also celestial or heavenly bodies and terrestrial bodies. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for one star differs from another star in glory. See, what he wants the people to know is, since God made all these different kinds of bodies, then He's certainly able, He's certainly capable to give us the appropriate kind of resurrected body. So He's still answering the question, how are the dead raised and what kind of body do they come? Paul says, you look around. Look at the natural world. Look at the different types of flesh. Look at the different types of bodies in the world, the heavenly bodies and the terrestrial bodies. God is able to make any kind of body that is needed. So Paul says, if He can do that, He can give you a resurrected body. He can make you, that person that goes into the ground, Paul says God can make that person come out of the ground with a perfect body to live eternally. And that's what He does. So Paul says, how are the dead raised up? With what kind of body? With the perfect body that God has designed. And there's going to be a great resurrection. I mean, they could be filmed all over the world, every cemetery. At the same time, people are going to come up out of those graves. People that's been dead 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 500 years, 5,000 years. They're all going to come up out of the grave. And they're going to have the perfect, Paul says, resurrected body. One that will spend eternity somewhere. That body will spend eternity in heaven or in hell. And it's all about the choices one makes while they're in this world. Whether they're going to believe the gospel and obey it or not. And so we always have those choices. We're always in that valley of decision the Old Testament talks about. Making decisions. Like this morning, do I need to ask for the prayers of the congregation? Only you know. And so Doug has chosen a song for us to consider our relationship. And if we do need to make that decision, I encourage you to do that while we stand and sing this song.